Hello, welcome back to CS++. This is our 5th lesson on Intro to Programming using JavaScript. And for this one, we're going to look at arrays, which are a way that we can take a bunch of variables and store them into one collection. So we're going to look at what an array is, how we can set it up, how we can create it empty or with things already populated in it, different ways that we can access different elements inside of the array. And then we'll see how we can use some different array methods that already exist to manipulate the arrays. And we'll look at some common algorithms that we would use with these arrays. And then we'll get into a simple assignment where we are going to loop through some different colors that are stored in a list. And then we'll create a list with a bunch of stuff in it. We'll print out the numbers. We will sum all those numbers up. We'll find the average. We'll find how many even numbers are in that list. And we'll find the largest. So let's look at first the array. So what you'll see here is that we have a variable called colors, except it's not a variable, it's a constant. So you could easily just make this let colors. But the problem with that is once you create a list, if you accidentally say colors equals 2 or green, and you meant to grab one of these things out of it, it will destroy the entire list and you will be left with only 2 or green. So if you make it a constant, you can still change what's inside of it. You can still add things, but you won't be able to destroy data. So we're going to use constant when we are creating arrays for this lesson. So if you want, you can just use these square brackets, which are on the right side of your keyboard above the enter or return key. And these square brackets, or just brackets, are going to be what denotes an array. So you can put things in there, and you can mix things in JavaScript. So you can put strings and numbers and booleans and all these different things in there. These two cases, they have the same things, but they don't have to be the same. So these have 3 strings, this has 4 integers, and you can add and use all these different things. You can also create an empty array, which you can add to later. So to do this, you just put empty brackets with nothing in it. So the nice thing about this is now numbers is an array, so you'll be able to use array methods later. Or like we saw earlier, you can populate it with whatever you want in there. Arrays in JavaScript are dynamic, so you can add and shrink and change the array as much as you want. So there are a couple ways that we can access different elements in an array in JavaScript. One of them is by using the square bracket notation or the bracket notation. And it works very similar to like char at and strings because it does index at 0. So in this case, red is 0, green is 1, and blue is 2. So if you wanted the first color, you can say the name of the array, square bracket 0. So that goes and gets the first thing in the list. So very, very similar to char at, except we use this bracket notation. And just like you can do with strings, you can get the length of an array. So if you say colors.length, this would return 3, because even though the last thing is 2, we have 3 things in that. You could also add using a method called push. For this one, this is going to add to the end of the array. So if you have an empty one called numbers, then if you say numbers.push10, it will, and this is a function or a method, so you would use parentheses, it would make this go to the end of the array, which the array is empty, so it would be the only element. If you pushed 20, then it would go on to the end of that. And then if you push 30, it would go to the end of that. So that's what we're going to focus on today. There are many other array methods that exist in JavaScript that are very useful. But now that you know how to use string methods, you should be able to easily look those up and use those on your own. There's things like getting parts of the array, adding things to the beginning, adding things to the end, getting things from the beginning, getting things from the end. So there's a whole number of different arrays you can use, or methods in the array class. And you might want to loop through the array. There's something called a for each loop that we're not going to go to in this lesson, but you can use a regular for loop, and you would just start at 0 and go less than the length of the array. So in this case, it would start at 0 and go until it's less than 3. So 0, 1, 2, adding 1 each time. And then you can use that bracket notation to go grab whatever that thing is. So this one would print 1 line at a time, 95, 87, 72. So we can also build a string like we did before, like very similar to what we did in the last lesson, but this time we're going to do it from a list or an array. And then you'll see we'll do all of these in the assignment, which again, the assignment is we're going to create a string just to warm up. And then we're going to use a for loop just to print those three things. And then the big part is going to be creating an empty array using a for loop to prompt the user for 5 numbers. And so once they put all those numbers in, then we will list those numbers out like we did in the last one. But this time we'll also get the sum. We'll find the average, and then we'll find the number of evens and the largest number. And we, again, want to make sure we pass all those tests. So step 1, open up index.html. You can open this in your little preview here with a magnifying glass as usual. You will have to open that in a browser to get that port to open. And this one is just as soon as you refresh it, it'll be there. So you can see that you can also open the browser console using the inspect or the F12 button. But we'll have these print out. Since that's already open, you can close this. And then we're going to be doing all of our work in our script.js. So for the warm-up, again, we're going to go step by step through this. So the very first step says create an array called colors with exactly 3 strings. So we'll say let colors equals, and then in brackets, we're going to say red, green, and blue. RGB. And then step 2, we just want to loop through this. So for this is just a regular for loop from last unit. So for let I equals 0, because that's the first item in a list. And then as long as I is less than colors dot length, and then I++. So that will loop through every index of our array. And then to print them out, this time we're going to use, instead of using an alert, we're going to use a console.log. So I'll show you what that looks like on your web browser. So console.log, and then we can print colors, and then space, or sorry, color, make sure that's not plural, plus colors at position I. So each time through that should print out the 0 thing, which is red, then green, then blue. And again, this is going to be in our console. So if you want to see this, and this is where you would check for errors as well, is you would refresh your page. And once that's refreshed, you can right click and inspect element. It looks different on all different web browsers. And now what you'll see is we have this right here. There's a console somewhere in there. This is Safari. But what you'll see here is a console. And it looks like currently this one hasn't printed anything yet. So we can go check our errors. If you do have an error, there might be an error here. But this one is just a error from code spaces, which you can't really do anything about. So you can ignore that one. So let's go back to our code and see if we did anything incorrect. So we are setting let colors. We're going until it's less than length. And then our index.html, we have our script tag here, so that should be fine. And then let colors equals red, green, and blue. Start at 0. As long as I is less than colors.length, you add 1, and then you console.log this. So let's go try that again. Maybe I didn't refresh it. And then I can inspect elements. And now in my console, oh, there was a filter on there, so I don't know why that was on there, but I click clear filters, and now you can see that I have color red, color green, and color blue. So again, if you do have errors and you can't figure it out, this is a great way to do it. And you will see your errors, and it will tell you what line number it thinks it's on. So you can use this to debug. It's a very good strategy to help debug this kind of stuff. All right, let's get to the main part. So this part is we're going to collect 5 users' numbers, and then we are going to store them into an array. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create that array. So we can say let, we'll call it numbers, equals, and then just empty brackets. So this is going to create an empty array. And then we want to go through a for loop to make sure they're entering a number. So for this one, we're not going to worry about actually if they don't put in valid numbers. We'll just assume for this one since we did that a couple times already. So for this one, let's go through a for loop. So for let I equal 0. And we can use I as many times as we want because it's only existing inside this loop. If we want to go 5 times, we can go until it's less than 5. So you could have started at 1 and then went until less than or equal to 5. But 0, again, is useful because we can use that for the position in our array if we ever need it, which we might not need here. And then we want to add 1 each time, so I++. And now we can grab an input from the user. So you can actually do this all in one step. So you can push it to the array and turn it into a number and get the prompt. So you could do numbers.push, which is going to add something to the end of the array. What do we want to add? Well, we want to add the input as a number. So parse, we'll do parse float. And then what are we parse floating? Well, the prompt. And the prompt should be enter a number or enter number. And then space, and then we want to actually print out what number that is. So the first one should be number 1. So our I currently is 0, so we would want to say in parentheses I plus 1. So instead of saying start at 0, we can say start at 1 and go to 5. So that can be done all in one step. So hopefully this correctly takes 5 numbers. And again, we're just going to assume that they're actually putting in real numbers in here. Otherwise, it's going to crash. But the tests for this one don't check to see if they are valid. So again, we'll assume they are. All right, next step, step 5, is going to be to print out these numbers. So we want to create a list out of this so we can build a string. So we can do similar to the last one. Let list equals, do we have one called list yet? I don't think so. So let list equal an empty string because we're going to build a string. And then we're going to loop through this again. So we're going to say let I equal 0 as long as I is less than numbers.length, and then I++ to add 1 each time. And inside of this, what we're going to do is we are going to do very similar to what we did before, where if it's the last thing in the list, we don't want to put a comma in there. So we can say if I equals numbers.length, then we want to print just a number. So we can say list plus equals just the current number. And this time the current number is an I, right? We're not going 1 to n. This time we're going to do numbers at position I. And then if it's not the last one, we want to do something very similar, except this time it's list plus equals numbers at I plus, and then a comma and a space. And again, for this one, instead of using an alert, we're going to do it in the console. So console.log. And this is going to be the string numbers, the capital N, colon, space, and then you can concatenate the string that we just built, which is called list. So let's check that out, right? We can do iterative testing. So once we do one little part, we can test it again and see if it works. So there you go. As you populate it, it's going to say, let's say 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. You don't see anything, but again, if you right click and inspect your element, you can go to your console and then you can see numbers 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. So in this case, we have a comma after the last one. So if we go back to our code, you will see that we have if numbers is equal to the length, right? So the length doesn't actually exist in the array. So you have to check the length minus 1 because it starts at 0. And then you can test it again, and that should work. All right, for the next part, we're going to do the sum of all the numbers. So there's a couple of ways you can do this, right? We can repurpose the for loop we already have. All right, so if you want to repurpose that for loop, you can just as easily say up here, let sum equal 0 to start sum at 0. And then what we can do is anywhere in here, we can just say sum plus equals numbers at I. And so you can see here, here's the code. It is console.log of sum with a space in between with capital S and then sum. So again, we can repurpose this for loop instead of having to loop through over and over again. So now we go back and we refresh this. We do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can open your console. And then you will see that the numbers are correct, no comma at the end, and then the sum is 15. The next one is the average, right? So if you think about it, we already have the sum, and we already know that the length of the array is how many things are in there. So literally all we have to do is calculate that average. So you don't have to round. So this is going to be a console. We can do all the math inside of here as well. So console.log, and it needs to say average, colon space, and then define the average inside parentheses to go order of operations. We can take the sum and divide it by numbers.length. And that will find the average for us. We don't have to round. We can also count the number of evens and find the largest number. So we're going to repurpose this same loop up here. Right? You could do another loop, but that's kind of a waste of memory. So to figure out how many evens there are, we're going to want to create another variable up here to count. So we'll call it let evens equal 0 to assume that there are no evens to start with. And then inside of here, we just have to check to see if it's divisible by 2. So if you remember back to the earlier lessons, there was a modulo operator, which was the percent sign. And if you divide something by 2 and there's no remainder, that means it must be even. So we can say if numbers at I divided by 2 equals 0, then we can just add 1 to evens, which you can use the shorthand way of saying evens plus plus. So only if it's an even number do we add it. If it's not, we just do nothing. And then all we have to do is print that. So console.log, and that's even count, colon space, and then we can just print out evens. Which we called evens. And that looks correct. And the last one is find the biggest. So for finding the biggest, you can do a couple things, right? You have to kind of figure out what do you think the biggest is going to be. You could say the biggest is something really, really small, so anything you see is going to be bigger than that. Or you can just assume that the very first thing is the biggest. So here we can do let, we'll call it biggest, equals numbers at 0. So we'll just assume the first thing is the biggest. And then if you did that, you wouldn't have to start at 0 because we already know that's the same. But since we already have this loop, we'll use it. And then here, as we loop through, we can say, well, if the current thing, which is numbers at I, if that is now larger than the biggest, then what do we want to do? Well, we just want to set the biggest now equal to numbers at I. So if the current thing is bigger than the biggest, then you set this to the biggest, and then when you're done, the biggest should be the biggest number that we saw in that list. And then we just have to print this out. So console.log, and this was largest, colon space, and then I called that variable biggest. And now we can test that out. So we just did a bunch of things. So we can go back and refresh, enter some numbers, 2, 77, 44, 3, 1. You don't see anything because you got to open up the console by inspecting. Find your console. You can see there are your numbers. There's the sum. There's your average. We had 2 even numbers in there, which looks correct. And the largest number was 77. So if we want to see if we did everything right, we're going to go over to our source control, give it a commit message. You can commit, which saves it locally, and push, which pushes it back to the cloud on github.com. And then after a few seconds, you can go back to your GitHub repository and refresh that. And then you should see that gold dot. That means it's still working. And if you click that, you can see that it hasn't completed yet. So you can see details. Again, you can see details if you open up each one of these, and it gives you a little autograder report. But it's a lot easier to see if you just go back to the summary. So as this goes, you gotta, again, make sure that all of your strings match correctly. So for this one, it's not as picky with making sure they enter numbers, right? So we'll just assume that when they do enter numbers, that they're actually entering numbers, because we could break this program and we can make it crash. But you can see for this one, we got all of them correct, and we got 100 out of 100. So that was arrays, and this is going to be super useful when we are trying to store a bunch of things. Because if you had a class of 30 students, you would have to create 30 grades for every assignment. And that would be just not manageable to keep that many variables throughout your program. So instead, we could have an array. And as you get more into this, you could even have an array of arrays, which is even more powerful. So that is it for arrays. On the next one, lesson 6, we're going to look at functions and how we can start writing our own functions. I'll see you then.